Hello and welcome to One-on-One with Dr. Ashni Singh. I'm Kimal King, your host for this discussion. Tonight we'll be talking about the Natural Resource Fund and the local content bill that the government intends to lay in the Parliament tomorrow. Good night, Dr. Singh.
Thank you very much, Kimal. Good night.
How are you doing?
Very good, thanks. Thank you very much for inviting me to be on this program.
Okay. Let's get right into it.
Sure.
These are two hefty bills that are going to be laid in the Parliament tomorrow, and it's been years since they were due. What can the public expect?
Sure. So, first of all, you are absolutely correct that these are two extremely substantial and important pieces of legislation, and indeed two long-awaited and much-anticipated pieces of legislation. The first, in no particular order, the first is the Natural Resource Fund bill, which is a bill that is going to be a bill that will address the establishment and operations of the Natural Resources Fund, which is the fund into which petroleum revenues are paid and from which transfers are made to the budget for the purposes of financing the budget, and also the balance of the fund of which is invested and saved for the purposes of addressing what is described in resource management as the intergenerational issues, ensuring that we save a portion of our resource revenue for future generations, recognizing, of course, the finite nature of natural resources. And so the first bill is going to address the establishment and operationalizing of the Natural Resource Fund, and I'd be happy to come back to elaborate a little bit more about what that bill is going to do.
Okay.
And the second bill addresses local content, and local content here refers to participation by the domestic economy and participation by Guyanese nationals in the oil and gas sector. And in particular, what local content legislation typically does is it specifies and it mandates, it requires minimum levels of participation by Guyanese companies and Guyanese nationals operating in various sectors. So it stipulates, and I'll come back to the mechanics of how that works.
Okay.
But what it does is it lays the foundation for participation by Guyanese companies and Guyanese nationals in the oil and gas sector from the point of view of supplying goods and services, which in turn, of course, will lead to development of capacity, generating of economic activity in the non-oil economy and so on, creation of jobs and so on. And so these two pieces of legislation, which address, like I said, those broad categories of matters, will be tabled in Parliament tomorrow. There's a lot of work has gone into the preparation of the bills that are going to be going to Parliament tomorrow, and we look forward to a full debate in the Parliament, and of course ultimately passage and implementation of the two bills.
Okay, thank you. Now let's talk a little bit about the Natural Resource Fund. There is currently an act in place. This act was passed in January 2019, shortly after a no-confidence motion was passed that had defeated the previous government. The PPP has always said that it will overhaul or revamp this legislation. Why is that necessary?
Well, it's necessary from a number of standpoints. So first of all, of course, you are right that there is an NRF Act on the law books. That act was indeed passed in January 2019, very hurriedly after the no-confidence motion in December 2018, so merely a month, less than a month perhaps, certainly merely a month, not more than a month after the no-confidence motion was passed in Parliament. And as you know, as viewers know, the passage of the no-confidence motion placed the then government in what at most could have been described as a caretaker mode until elections were called, and elections were required to be called within 90 days, as we all know by now.
Yes.
That did not happen, and so on and so forth. I won't repeat that saga. But what happened was, having been placed in caretaker mode, with the expectation that Parliament be dissolved and an election called. Instead, the then APNU AFC proceeded to force through the Parliament a natural resource fund bill, I will call it NRF bill, an NRF bill, which then became law with presidential assent at the end of January 2019. So that bill, now Act, of course has first and foremost a problem with legitimacy and constitutionality. It has a fundamental flaw, having been taken through Parliament at a time when Parliament had already was already in a state where it should have been dissolved. So there is, and there have been, there's been a lot that has been said about the acts that were done and actions that were taken during that period.
Yes.
So there is an issue first and foremost with the fact that the bill was taken through Parliament during a period when the Parliament should have been dissolved, which infects that NRF Act with some very, what many would view as fatal defects, a circumstance of having a problem with legitimacy in the first instance. But then secondly, if you were to put that matter aside, momentous though that matter might be, if you were to put that matter aside and examine the contents of the bill, I would not say that the entire bill is useless or dreadful or anything like that. I would say that there are certainly provisions in the bill. It's not a perfect piece of legislation. It's not the way that perhaps, if we were doing this from scratch, it's not perhaps the way that we would have done this. But, there are some sections of it that I think are potentially workable. But there are quite a few aspects of it that have very serious problems, which we have highlighted as a party when we were in opposition and as a government since we've assumed office. And I'll mention a few of the problems that it has that have to be remedied. I should point out, in fact, that notwithstanding that they passed this act in Parliament in January 2019 and held on to government illegally until August 2020, all of my researches suggest that they never brought the act into operation. So Section 1 of the act requires an order to be issued by what's called a commencement order to be issued to bring it into operation. I've searched and I've inquired, and all of my researches suggest that a commencement order, which is required by Section 1 of the Act, was never issued. So it was never actually brought into operations. It's a little bit odd that they forced it through Parliament, that their president, the then president, signed it, assented to it, they gazetted it, but then never issued the commencement order to bring it into operation. I've asked my staff to continue researching this matter just to be doubly sure, but thus far they have not been able to find a commencement order published anywhere in the Gazette. So if you put aside the fact that the bill went to Parliament when it did, and if you put aside the fact that it was not brought into operation for reasons best known to them, unless I find a commencement order, and if you were then set aside those two matters and look into the contents of the Act, there are a number of issues, like I said, that we've highlighted before, and I want to mention just a few of these.
Sure.
The first is that, and we have spoken about this, the then leader of the opposition, now Vice President, has spoken about this point extensively. The first is that there is a fundamental problem with governance and management of the fund as contemplated by the act that the APNU AFC put into law. What do I mean by this? I mean the following. A number of critical governance structures are not in place, have been, whether deliberately or otherwise, omitted. And in place of those critical governance structures, alternative structures have been put in place to create the smoke screen that there is some form of governance.
Okay.
What do I mean by this? The fund, first of all, in their act, is not governed or overseen or managed by a board of directors. So there's no board of directors or no governing board or no council or anything like that. Instead, all of the powers that would traditionally be vested in a board of directors, all of those powers are vested in the minister. So the minister has vast powers regarding the overall management of the fund, regarding approving its operations, overseeing its operations. Really, really extensive, vast and extensive, and indeed intrusive powers. Sweeping powers are given to the minister, which powers would ordinarily be vested in a board of directors or in a governing board or council.
Okay.
So that's the first issue. So the first issue is the absence of a board of directors. The second issue is overreach, excessive powers, and excessive functions being vested in the minister. That's the second issue. And the third issue is, instead of having a board of directors that would manage this fund in a proper and professional manner, a smoke screen is created by the establishment of an elaborate, what's described as a public accountability and oversight committee.
Yes.
Very elaborate committee comprising stakeholders of all sorts, representing every single stakeholder body that you can possibly imagine, all 10 regions, non-governmental stakeholders. I think it has about 22 members or so.
Yes.
Drawing from, like I said, everywhere. Now, a committee like this cannot perform the governance fundamental over responsibility, cannot substitute for a board.
Okay.
Cannot perform day-to-day oversight of the management of the fund, approve operational policies, assess performance. That's the role of a professional board of directors. It's not the role of a multi-stakeholder committee. We would be the first to champion the cause of multi-stakeholder committees from the standpoint of access to information, performance of non-governmental oversight functions, sort of accountability arrangements and so on. We'd be the first to champion the cause of a multi-stakeholder committee for that purpose, but not for the purpose of exercising oversight over the operations and assessing the effectiveness of the performance. In the absence of a board, such a committee cannot substitute.
Okay.
And so, and in addition, the mere dysfunctionality of a 22-member committee, in a small country like ours, you can imagine, trying to reach consensus in a committee of 22. So there are all sorts of issues associated with this, this smoke screen that is created, this parallel structure that is created to give the impression that there is oversight and governance and good governance and management, when in fact there isn't. So that's that's another issue. So the first broad set of issues that I would raise is the very poor and almost non-existent. So what you have here, imagine what you have here. You have no board of directors. You have a 22-member committee, 22-member multi-stakeholder committee, which basically means that you don't have any real oversight of the management and operations of the fund and of the performance of the fund, which really means that the only person performing that function is the minister.
Right.
So hence the concerns that were expressed by the Vice President earlier about excessive reach by the minister under that architecture. So the first broad point that I would say is non-existent governance and very weak management arrangements. That would be the first point that I would make. The second point that I would make, the second major fundamental flaw that I would identify is, and it's kind of related to the first, is the deliberate establishment, or deliberate or otherwise, the establishment, whether deliberate or otherwise, of a mechanism for making transfers from the fund to the budget that is designed, that mechanism under that act is designed to ensure ministerial control and is designed to be opaque and devoid of transparency.
Okay.
What do I mean by this? Here again, a number of smoke screens are created. A very elaborate macroeconomic committee is established. That macroeconomic committee is expected to recommend an economically sustainable amount. And then the finance minister determines a fiscally sustainable amount, and then there is an elaborate formula that looks at the economically sustainable amount and the fiscally sustainable amount, looks at benchmark petroleum revenue, then looks at production constrained benchmark revenue, production constrained petroleum revenue, a very elaborate mechanism.
Okay.
When in fact the minister is appointing the committee, which is determining the economically sustainable amount. The minister is determining a fiscally sustainable amount, and the minister is therefore determining, when you peel aside all of these elaborate layers, what you have really is a mechanism where the minister completely controls how much is going to be transferred into the fund. And so you have a lack of clarity. If you speak to the man in the street can't explain to you what is the formula that governs the transfer of resources from the fund to the budget. Nobody can explain that to you.
Okay.
And so, but a very elaborate, complicated structure set up, here again, to create the impression of rigor, technical rigor, and to use all sorts of complicated language and technical language, speaking about economically and fiscally sustainable amount,
yes,
to create this veneer of rigor, when in fact what you have is a completely opaque mechanism that is completely controlled by the minister and that is devoid of any transparency whatsoever. That's a second major defect.
Okay.
And so we want to address, there's some other issues too, including, for example, the Vice President has already spoken publicly also about wanting to make sure that this perhaps is the third major issue that I would highlight, wanting to make sure that we never return to a situation where a Minister of Finance can attempt to conceal a signing bonus that attempted during that period. I think that's been amply, perhaps not amply, but it has been abundantly ventilated in the public domain, the attempt.
Yes.
And so we've said that we would like to explicitly require the minister to publish within 3 months every single deposit into the fund, to publish in the Gazette and to notify the National Assembly, and to make failure to do so a criminal offense.
Okay.
We've said so publicly, and we are proposing to do so in the bill that we're taking to Parliament. And this, of course, is intended to reinforce transparency and to ensure that we avoid any risk of a return to the perversity that occurred in relation to the signing bonus. And so the bill that we're taking to Parliament, while it does not discard in its entirety what was put in place by the APNU AFC, it does seek to address the most fundamental deficiencies of the bill that have been taken through the Parliament by the APNU AFC. And it seeks to make, like I said, first of all, to strengthen governance and management, to improve transparency and accountability, yes, and in particular to increase the penalties for non-publication of information. And in that regard, and very, very important, perhaps most importantly, strengthens by improving by first of all simplifying and making more transparent and removing discretion in the determination of the amount that will be transferred from the fund to the budget.
Okay. Now, could you talk about what the mechanism for the transfer of funds from the fund would look like?
Well, I don't want to preempt the disclosures that will be contained in the bill.
Okay.
The bill is going to be, publicly available tomorrow. It's going to be laid in Parliament tomorrow, and
okay.
it's not my intention to, be preemptive in any way. But I will say that the formula is a very simple formula that defines, that links the amount that will be transferred from the fund to the budget, that basically defines a link, a very clear and easily understandable link between the inflows to the fund in 1 year and the transfers to the budget in the next year in a very simple and transparent and easily computable manner. And so that, the details of that will be, obviously publicly known tomorrow once we table the bill, but I can assure you it's a very simple, any layman can read it and understand exactly what we're saying. And that's what we want every single Guyanese person to be able to read the schedule to this act and to be able to understand exactly, this is the formula, this is the basis of how much is going to be transferred.
Okay, and I understand that the government is not the only party that has criticized this for this iteration of the fund. You've pointed out that the Inter-American Development Bank also made this criticism.
Yes, in fact, everybody who has commented on the bill, on the act, every single person who has commented on the act has highlighted the complexity of the formula as a major deficiency of the act. You mentioned the book published by the IDB on resilient institutions for the Caribbean. That book has a very substantial chapter that addresses resource management in the region, and it was scathing. The book was, frankly speaking, very condign and scathing in its description of the formula. You will recall that it said that the formula, first of all, cannot possibly achieve the objective that it says that it will achieve.
Right.
And secondly, is incomprehensible. It's far too complex, cannot be understood, and is very reflective of very bad practice. The language was very explicit and scathing that was used in that publication.
Yes. I remember it also said that it conspires against transparency and public understanding.
Oh, absolutely. It was, I struggle to, I would like to give the AP and new AFC the benefit of the doubt, but I struggle to arrive at any other conclusion but that this was designed to confuse and to obfuscate. Even if I were to give them the maximum benefit of the doubt, I am unable to arrive at a conclusion other than that this complex formula was designed to obfuscate, designed to conceal and confuse. And Kemal, you might have read the formula yourself. If you have, I'd be happy for us to speak about it off. It would take us a long time on camera, but I'd be happy to have a conversation about it off camera to get your thoughts on, if you have read it. And if you haven't read it, I would encourage you to read it. I'd encourage, in fact, all of your viewers. The NRF Act is publicly available. It's on the Ministry of Finance website. Download the Act and have a read of the formula. It's contained in Schedule 1 of the Act. Have a read of it and come back and let me know what you think of it, what your own thoughts are.
Of course. Minister, last week we had a visit from a Ghanaian delegation, and they also took a look at the bill, I suppose. What were their thoughts on it? And could you tell me a little bit about the consultation stage of this bill?
Sure. So we have, of course, been getting the benefit of advice from a number of experts, subject matter experts, and in particular we have had the privilege of having advice from a Ghanaian team who have examined the legislation. They've examined examples from elsewhere around the world as well, and we've got some very good advice from them. We, of course, we had to make the choice between completely discarding this act and starting afresh and writing a completely new framework. That was one option, and perhaps might have been the ideal option. But I mean, first of all, we wanted to avoid creating the impression that we're discarding everything that they had done, throwing it in the bin and starting from afresh. In the first instance, we didn't, as you know, we've been at pains to say that that's not our approach to governance. We're not, going to discard everything that they did and, scrap it just because they did it and start it back. So we very deliberately did not want to do that. And secondly, we wanted to get the benefit of global experience from not just one country, but a number of different places, Ghana being one, and a very important one, but many other places. So we certainly, had extensive discussions and consultations with the experts that came from Ghana. We got the benefit of their perspectives. And that, incidentally, was an international perspective. It was not only a Ghanaian perspective, because the people with whom we spoke had, of course, experience not only in Ghana, but had quite a lot of very rich universal experience.
Okay.
And so we had very, very good discussions with them, as a result of which we've been able to incorporate, like I said, we've been able to incorporate what we believe are a number of critical amendments which make the existing framework operable in the first instance, a lot more transparent and easy to understand, a lot more accountable from the standpoint of good management and governance practices, and a lot more accountable from the standpoint of public accountability, like I said, in particular strengthening the publication provisions and the penalty provisions and so on. So I think on the whole we were able to strike a good balance between, a complete discard of what was produced before, and something that is very operational and operable.
Okay, so this is an amendment, not a whole new act.
Well, it's, in fact, this is itself something that we debated quite a lot.
Okay.
And, we had a discussion about whether to amend or whether to repeal. There was a view that because this act had this problem of illegitimacy, given when there is in fact a view that this act is constitutionally defective because it was enacted by a parliament that should have been dissolved.
Yes.
And so the balance of opinion ended up being that what we should do is repeal and replace. But in repealing and replacing, we are not discarding in entirety what existed before.
All right. So in addition, would the government have to issue this commencement order, granted that you don't find the one?
Yes. So once the new act would have been enacted, passed by Parliament and assented to by the President, we have preserved the requirement that a commencement order be issued, and we will then be issuing one.
Okay. Let's move on to the local content bill. Since we were on the topic of consultations, we have had a few local content policies under the previous administration, and one of the criticisms that they got from the private sector was that they did not consult enough, and that if they made suggestions, they did not feel as though their suggestions were heeded. How has the government learned from this lesson?
Well, the local content legislation is, first of all, let me say, very, very important, because, like I said, it provides the basis for local participation in the industry. And it's a piece of legislation that really is of dear and close interest to many stakeholders across the economy. And in a sense, you have almost two ends of the spectrum, or two extremities of views, two sets of views at two extremities. On the one hand, of course, you have the industry, the oil and gas industry, which ideally would like to be able to operate free of any restraint or free of any constraint.
Yes.
Ideally, the oil and gas industry would like to have the complete freedom to be able to buy from whomsoever they wish, without any sort of mandatory local content obligations and so
Yes.
on. They may be amenable to a local content policy, they may, as a matter of corporate social responsibility, support the domestic economy, but ideally they would prefer to be free of any statutory and binding constraint
Yes.
on what they should buy and how much they should buy and from where they should buy it and so on. So you have at one end the industry, and the other end you have, of course, a domestic non-oil economy who understandably and perfectly understandably and rightly would like to get a large share of the business that is being generated by the oil and gas sector.
Yes.
And that's a natural and perfectly legitimate expectation by Guyanese businesses and Guyanese nationals. And at that end of the spectrum, Guyanese companies and Guyanese nationals would, of course, like to get 100% of the business.
Yes.
But in each of those two extremities, there are constraints and issues that need to be considered. So on the one hand, from the oil and gas, from the oil company perspective or the oil industry perspective, while the companies might want complete freedom, subject to their corporate social responsibility, complete freedom to be able to buy from everywhere, we have an obligation and we have a responsibility to ensure that Guyanese businesses and Guyanese individuals, Guyanese nationals, get some of the business, get as much of the business as they possibly can. We have a responsibility to encourage and facilitate growth in the Guyanese private sector, the indigenous domestic private sector. And so we have, and we would like to, and we're seeking through this bill, to put in place minimum requirements that will stipulate that in certain sectors or in relation to certain categories of goods and services, the oil companies shall have to procure a minimum percentage of those goods and services
Yes.
from Guyanese nationals and Guyanese companies. But we have to do so in a manner that ensures that we don't undermine the competitiveness of the oil companies, because, or indeed do so in a manner that does not stymie their operations completely, because, as you know, we are still a relatively small economy. We are still to develop the capability and the capacity to produce a lot of the inputs that are required by these oil companies. And so we can't stipulate percentages that will put the oil companies in a position where it will be impossible to comply, or where they will be buying things that are, extraordinarily, where there simply isn't capacity to supply them. Let me put it like that.
Right.
Because that would completely stymie their operations. That will grind their operations to a halt. If you say you have to buy 100% of these inputs locally, and those inputs are not available locally, then you're basically saying to the sector, you're frustrating them to the point of closure.
Of course.
So you have to strike a balance there and then of course, we have to keep an eye on competitiveness of inputs as well, because the cost of production impacts cost oil, which impacts profit oil, which impacts government revenue.
Yeah.
So we also have an interest in ensuring, as a country, we have an interest in ensuring that the oil companies are as competitive as they possibly can. But at the same time, we have an interest in ensuring that they give as much business as they possibly can to the domestic private sector. And then at the other end of the spectrum, whilst we would happily and readily say we would like 100% of all of these inputs to be purchased from Guyanese companies and Guyanese nationals, we have to take account of domestic capacity to produce the goods and services at the scale that is required, with the level of timeliness that is required, at the level of quality, and when you're dealing with an international industry like the oil and gas industry, you're talking about things like quality certification as well. It's not just quality in a sort of emotional or qualitative sense. quality from the point of view of recognized international certification. And so we have to also, and we're seeking also, to give as much of the business as we possibly can to domestic companies and nationals, whilst at the same time taking into account capacity to produce those goods and services. So a balance had to be struck between those competing objectives, which I believe we have struck. And so what the local content bill seeks to do is it legislates minimum targets by sector or by category of input, goods and services. It lists a series of industries or goods and or products or goods and services, however you might wish to describe them. And it stipulates target percentages to be achieved by a specified date in relation to the volume or value of local supplies to be procured by the oil companies for each of those categories.
Right.
And like I said, I think we've struck a balance. We of course have ultimately these things are going to be subject to review periodically. It's, we have to put in place the framework. The schedule of the local content bill has the local content targets for each category of input. But then in the course of implementation, we will have to assess how we're implementing, the success with which we're implementing it and so on. But I think we've struck a very good balance between ensuring a viable and competitive oil and gas sector, and also ensuring that, the level of inputs from the domestic private sector is optimized.
Okay. Now, Minister of Natural Resources Vikram Bharat has said that while these are strong targets, they are realistic. The government has made sure to make them that way. What happens when a timeline comes and you find that companies have not met their targets?
Well, let me say this, that the bill also provides for an architecture to be established for monitoring of implementation. So there's going to be a secretariat. Local content secretariat will be established and will be staffed for the purposes of monitoring implementation. And they're going to be establishing a local content register. Companies are going to be registering on that. Companies and nationals are going to be registering on that register. And they will be monitoring progress towards achievement of the targets. Now, in the event we see that targets are not being met for reasons of lack of effort on the part of the oil companies, because of course the Secretary will be monitoring compliance, then they will take appropriate action as provided for in the bill. But they recognize too, no doubt they will recognize, as we do already, that we also need to keep a close eye on the supplier side to ensure that we do actually have the capacity to deliver the level of inputs and the types of inputs that are stipulated. Because there may very well be a circumstance, there are a variety of alternatives, there are a number of alternative scenarios that could arise. In some categories of goods and services, we may very well discover that from the time the bill comes into, the act comes into operation, we are already at the target, which might suggest that perhaps in the next round we might need to raise the target, to raise the bar a little bit. Or we may very well find that in some categories that the target is not being achieved despite best efforts on the part of the industry, and then we might need to reassess capacity on the supplier side and consider whether some recalibration of the target might not be needed to make it more realistic. And then thirdly, an alternative scenario where we discover that targets are not being met because the industry is not making best efforts to comply with the target, in which the relevant provisions of the Act will apply. Okay.
Now, in addition to legislating quotas for local involvement in the industry, how is the government helping to prepare locals to provide goods and services and be employed?
Well, this is an extremely good question that you've asked, and this point came up. In fact, the Vice President convened a consultation with the private sector I was there, and a number of my cabinet colleagues were there as well. The Attorney General was there, Minister of Natural Resources was there as well. And this question of capacity development came up. And it's an issue that we recognize will need to be addressed. And it's you know, the bill does include a number of provisions as they relate to capacity development. But on the policy side too, it's a matter that we will be considering in terms of, you know, building capacity, you know, not only from the standpoint of, you know, technical capacity in that sense, but also from the standpoint of, you know, knowing what the procurement opportunities are, knowing how to participate in them, helping, you know, walking companies through the process of getting onto the register, competing for a business opportunity with the sector and so on. So we have said explicitly that there will be a capacity development component to the work of the Secretariat.
Okay.
Recognizing precisely the point that you just mentioned.
Okay, Minister, these laws have been long in the making because it's been about 6 years since our first discovery. What's the one takeaway that you want to leave with our viewers from the laying of these bills?
Given that the announcement that there was oil, the confirmation that there was oil was made, I think, May 2015 or thereabouts. Right. And first oil, of course, came, I think, December 2019. Given that we knew with certainty that there was oil, offshore oil in Guyana in 2015, concerted effort should have been devoted at that time to put in place the requisite legal framework. And tragically, 4 years, almost 5 years elapsed without the then government putting in place any modicum of a legal framework. On the local content side, well, as you know, there's nothing on the law books, absolutely nothing on the law books. And on the natural resources, which, I mean, it causes one to wonder whether there was any whether there was no concern whatsoever about local content, whether they were only playing lip service to local content but had no interest in local content, whether they were more preoccupied with other things, theft of an election perhaps, than with addressing the imperative of putting in place I mean, we know that, you know, they did spend from December 2018 to August 2020 in a, you know, very obvious attempt to engage in a heist of democracy.
Yes.
And, you know, that was a very substantial part of their term, if you know, consider it. Perhaps almost a half of their term was spent attempting to execute a heist of democracy. So I don't know whether it was lack of interest in putting in place the local content legislation or whatever it was. But the fact of the matter is that nothing was done about putting in place local content legislation. And in relation to the NRF, and I should say that, and it is tragically unfortunate that absolutely nothing was done in relation to local content legislation. And as it relates to the NRF, it's extremely unfortunate that, you know, nothing was done while there was an active parliament. There was an active parliament from 2015, shortly after the election when the parliament was called, until December 2018. There was a very live and active parliament. There was ample opportunity for an NRF Act to be taken to Parliament and to be passed, but one was not. And instead one was forced through the Parliament in January 2019. It was the most unfortunate, considering the importance of the legislation. And then it's it's additionally unfortunate that what was taken through Parliament was so defective in its contents. I guess that is perhaps water under the bridge. Mm-hmm. We committed to putting in place even prior to coming into office, we committed to putting in place, that we will put in place these pieces of legislation as soon as we come into office. We have been working very hard on, first of all, taking stock of what existed, addressing the immediate imperatives of the country, including, of course, the pressing urgency of COVID-19 and the effect that COVID-19 has had on people's lives and livelihoods and so on. But I think it's if I say so, even if I say so myself, I think it's an extremely commendable achievement that we've been able to put together very strong and credible legislation to address these two important issues. Mm-hmm. I think, frankly speaking, too, that it's I'm pleased that we've been able to do so in a manner that does not completely discard what they had put in place. There is a view that it should have been discarded and a new piece of legislation should have been put in place. And I'm happy that we were able to salvage some parts of it.
Yes.
And come up with a piece of legislation that is very robust and strong. We look forward now to these bills being submitted tomorrow. What we have now is a very strong framework for managing the oil and gas sector in the form of the local content bill and the natural resource fund bill. We look forward to these two critical bills being tabled in Parliament tomorrow. We look forward to a rich and lively debate in the Parliament. The Parliament is always a lively place. But we hope that good sense will prevail, and that the bills will be seen for their merits, and that they will enjoy smooth and unanimous passage through the Parliament. That is really my fervent wish, because we need these pieces of legislation critically in place. We have good bills now which, despite the occasional rancor of our political environment, made a conscious effort to preserve some of what they attempted to do. Mm-hmm. And so I hope that they recognize the value and virtue of that, and that the two bills that we're taking to Parliament will be passed. Like I said, I'm hoping for unanimous passage.
Okay, wonderful. You've been watching One-on-One with Dr. Ashni Singh, Senior Minister in the Office of the President with responsibility for finance. Thank you for watching and have a good night.
Thank you very much, Kemal. Thank you very much to your viewers as well.